So hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar. It's fantastic to see so many of you joining us from across the world, and I'd like to encourage everyone to say hello to us. Let us know where you're joining us from in the chat. So today's webinar, we will be recording it. So if you're not able to attend the whole thing, you'll be shared a copy of the link afterwards, so you can catch up on anything else afterwards. But today we are going to be discussing the important role of school leaders in developing global citizenship. And I'm absolutely delighted to bring together our esteemed panel to discuss the topic in more detail. So we're going to begin with some introductions before moving on to a panel discussion. And as I said, this is a discussion focused webinar, so we really want to hear your experiences throughout today's session. So I'm going to also launch a poll, because it'd be great to hear your understanding of global citizenship, and please do take part in that. And we'll be sort of discussing everyone's findings as well. There's no right or wrong answer to anything that we're asking. After we've done our introductions, we'll have our panel discussion around our topic of the role of school leaders in developing global citizenship. I'll also provide a brief course overview for MA Educational Leadership in Practice, and there'll be some contact details as well if you have anything that you want to follow up with us afterwards. Throughout the session, if you do have questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can also use the Q&A function in Zoom, and we'll be monitoring that throughout today. So for those of you who I've not spoken to before, I'm Hazel. I'm the course advisor here at the University of Manchester for MA Educational Leadership in Practice, and I'm here to support prospective students to make sure you've got enough information to make an informed decision about studying one of our courses. I'm now going to hand over to Dr. B. Hughes and ask her to introduce ourselves and move on to introduce the rest of our panel.
Well, thank you, Hazel, very much for that generous introduction, and a very warm welcome from me here in Manchester to people, I think, from Nigeria and China and South America. We warmly welcome you to this webinar, and we hope you will engage with us during the course of this next hour. I note that Hazel has issued a poll, so do fill that in if you can. I don't know any of the answers. I don't know whether my panel, they probably do, actually. So without further ado, I'm a senior lecturer here in Education Policy and Leadership at the University of Manchester. I reside alongside Karen and Edda in the Institute of Education, the Manchester Institute of Education, and I work directly on the Education Leadership in Practice Masters that some of us are directly involved with. Shall I hand over to Edda to ask her to give a brief introduction? Hazel, would that be okay? Edda, over to you.
Thank you, Vi. Thank you, Hazel, and thank you all for being here. My name is Adesan, Dr. Adesan, and I'm also a senior lecturer here at the Manchester Institute of Education at the University of Manchester. I was once a former citizenship teacher back in Spain. That was years ago, and ever since my work has been around studying, researching, and teaching citizenship and democratic education. Thank you.
Thanks, Edda. Anita, please.
Hello, yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anita Day. I am Head of Social and Computer Sciences at Loretto Grammar School in Altrincham, just outside of Manchester. And I'm currently in the final throes of the second year of the MA Education Leadership in Practice course that some of you may be considering.
Thanks, Anita. And Karen.
Hi, everybody, and thanks, Hazel and B. I'm Karen. I'm currently a lecturer in education, educational leadership, in fact, at the Institute of Education at Manchester. A long time ago, I was a school leader, which generated really my interest in leadership and particularly governance that shapes leadership.
Thank you, Karen. And as you probably heard from all of my colleagues and myself, we are all former teachers. within the educational sector. I was a former high school teacher and head teacher, so we have some practical experience. Some of us might not be able to remember all of it because it may have been some time ago, but I'm sure my colleagues are much closer to their former professional experiences than perhaps I am. But a warm welcome to you all, and again, thank you so much for joining us. This is a discussion, so hopefully you will, if you're participating, feel comfortable in asking questions through the chat, or indeed responding to us as we go through and have a conversation. But I'll open up the discussion first, and maybe come to you, Edda. As you are, our resident expert on citizenship education and have taught citizenship and written about it and certainly researched it now within your higher education experience, can you talk us through your own thinking, perhaps, about or around global citizenship?
Thank you, Vi, and thank you, everybody. Yes, I can talk a little bit about this. I need to admit, as Vi already mentioned, that my area is citizenship more than global citizenship, but I have had the pleasure to work with people who are real experts in global citizenship and learn lots from them. And I actually have written with them 2 books on global citizenship. So I will be very basically summarizing some of the ideas that together we have been putting in this work. And I would like to talk very briefly about how I understand global citizenship and the relationship with education, which I think is also a core aspect of what we're doing here today. And I would say that overall, there is 3 main ways of understanding what global citizenship is and how it relates to education. The first way really has to do with economics and has to do with human capital theories and thinking about what are the knowledge and skills that people, learners, young people, if we're thinking about schools, need to learn if they need to participate in a global market. We are here thinking about a highly globalized world. So what are the knowledge and skills that are needed? And also what are the knowledge and skills that are needed to make young people be more competitive within the national market, so the national market is more competitive with the overall global markets, if that makes sense. So here we're talking about, for instance, learning languages. For those of you whose main language is not English, you know that learning English is kind of a major demand in order to improve your competitiveness as a worker, but also improve the competitiveness of your country. There is obviously major critiques of this approach. I particularly like a critique made by Zygmunt Bauman, the Polish philosopher who used to work in Leeds. And he talks about how the world is articulated around 2 types of global citizens. Some are tourists. Some people actually have the ability to travel around the world, don't need visas, can move around and can enjoy globalization in that way. But he also talked that globalization has also brought vagabonds, people who have no other choice actually to travel because their circumstances at home are not welcome, or because it's not enough resources, or so on. So he kind of questioned that only by learning languages one should be able to have this competitiveness regardless. So this is the first approach. The second approach, and I'm trying to get a little bit into the point here because otherwise it might take forever. The second approach is more humanistic traditions. And here we are coming from a tradition of Immanuel Kant and a long tradition of particularly European philosophy, but not only European, emphasizing that to be global citizens, we need to learn certain shared values, certain knowledges that somehow are necessary for us of us to kind of survive as a species. We could be here linking it back to the Sustainable Development Goals in terms of what type of values, what types of knowledge, what types of attitudes, behaviors we should all be having to contribute to the global society. In that case, the role of education obviously would be facilitating that all young people learn these knowledges and these values and these skills that are necessary for all of us to work together in the world. But there is also a critique to this approach, and that leads me to the third approach of global citizenship, which is who gets to decide what are these knowledges, what are these values, and who is to be considered human. A third approach that usually relies on the decolonial tradition emphasizes that humanist approaches have usually prioritized humanity as understood by white men, middle class in Europe. And obviously that's highly problematic because humanity is much beyond white men writing from Europe in the 17th century. So in that respect, these approaches try to put the emphasis on suggesting that we are all humans, that to an extent we are all global citizens. And what we should be doing is actually not about, as educators, we should not be uncovering the truth. We should not be telling the others, as Vanessa Andriotti phrased, who is a major expert in global citizenship, we should not be telling the others what are the values that we need to embrace, but more, we should actually be looking at the way in which the world as a global entity has reproduced certain injustices, and also in the way in which we are all interconnected and we need to learn from each other if we are to survive. So these are the three major approaches to global citizenship and education, and I guess I leave it to you to decide. I was probably quite biased here, but the conversation goes on in everybody discussing how you feel more about it.
That is so helpful and insightful, Edda. Thank you. I'm going to pick you up and come back at you, if I may, in relation to your comment about whose values the shared values are. We'll pick up that in a minute. And you suggested that the kind of global citizenship may be perceived and seen and framed around a colonial worldview, white middle-class men from Europe, perhaps, with probably also a capitalist mindset. And I think you suggested that actually global citizenship in its framing is perhaps, from a critical point of view, more anthropocentric as opposed to ecocentric. In other words, it's just human-based, where other people are talking about climate and so on and so forth within that whole kind of broad term of global citizenship. So that's so helpful. I'm going to come to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in a minute. But I'm just going to respond because I've got the global citizenship thoughts from our participants. And 88% of people have just suggested that global citizenship may be associated with thinking beyond local and national boundaries. And I think all of us on the call here would probably agree with that. And also about promoting social justice and equity. We obviously, as scholars, might want to unpack and unpick social justice and indeed equity, but that's for another webinar perhaps. And 63% of colleagues, in fact, awareness of global issues like climate change, poverty and human rights. And of course that would suggest that global citizenship in its as an umbrella term is extending to human rights, climate change and so on and so forth. We have climate change education, for example. We have environmental education. We have education for sustainable development. And these framings are helpful and useful, but can cause tension and issue, perhaps. And maybe we'll come back to that. And then 63% of colleagues on the call, we weren't able to contribute to this poll, by the way. We were not allowed to, apparently, but so this is all your own work. Taking actions such as volunteering or sustainable practices to address global issues at 63%. And then some people added to the chat around that. There was less kind of consensus around the second question that we asked, which was, what is the main benefit for education leaders? I'm going to pause there, Hazel, if you can pull that back up later, because we're going to get onto leadership in a moment, if that's okay, and I'll come back to the poll when we get onto leadership. But let's just go back, if I may, to the Sustainable Development Goals, and I know that we have an expert in the field, as in Edda, that told me, we had a bit of a chat before this call, and I hadn't realised that out of the 17 overarching goals, there are 169 targets attached to those 17 goals and 247 indicators. Now, the reason I'm sharing that is, of course, for some of us, we see the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as a useful model for which we can think about global citizenship. But when we kind of start to dig a bit deeper, we understand there are issues and tensions with that particular framing, particularly from the United Nations themselves, in that there are no common agreements or definitions about global citizenship, particularly in education. So the question really is posing to us is, how can leaders and teachers then develop a programme or understandings of global citizenship when there's no common agreement from perhaps the kind of more authentic channels that may suggest that there might be. So Edda, can you possibly just share with us a little bit about this notion of problematization of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals? What are the issues around those? What are their limitations, particularly relating to global citizenship?
Yes, B. Well, that's you're putting me here in the spot. There is a lot of complexities there.
Yeah,
I
there
get
are.
to be fair, when as far as I know, and as I emphasize, I am more an expert in citizenship than in global citizenship. When
Sure.
United Nations decided to have this aspect in the quality education, emphasizing in global citizenship, it was a specific decision made to not acknowledge democracy, and rather.
Right.
And it was a geopolitical decision not to acknowledge democracy, but rather focusing in global citizenship. Having said that, there is different controversies associated with that. One of that is this idea of putting global citizenship as a target, as some sort of aspiration. There is a lot of critique that's emphasized, well, there is no real status allocation to global citizens. We don't have a passport of global citizens. We don't have even real legal rights in many cases where there is this allocation. Therefore, if there is not such a thing, why don't we just take it as a kind of a starting point? We are already global citizens, rather than all of us, rather than something that we are to aspire. Otherwise, there is this assumption that some people might be more global citizens than others, and that's highly problematic. So I think that's it from me. I can carry on.
No, Eda, that's absolutely fantastic. Thank you. It's just trying to understand and unpack a little bit the geopolitics and the politics of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. But in the main, they can be useful for us as educators in terms of our schools and our leadership of and governance of global education and global citizenship. So let's just move on. We've done a bit of the macro in terms of the global understandings around the framings of global citizenship. But the title of this webinar, of course, is the important role of school leaders. So let's now move a little bit more into this notion of what is the role that leaders play or can play or should not play in relation to global citizenship and teaching it or expressing it through curricula. Now, Karen, I know you've written a lot about governance and teaching and leadership. What in terms of your understandings from your perhaps own experiences, and Anita, I might ask you the same question. What do you think the main role of school leaderships is in developing understanding even of global citizens within educational contexts?
Yeah, thanks, B. That's interesting question and quite complex. So perhaps my starting point, because of my research interest, is around education governance, which ties nicely with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And as a consequence of that is school governance as well, as a more local level, and how that shapes what we understand leadership to be, but also what the role of the leader is, or the work of the leader is in situ. And Ed has talked about the UN Sustainable Development Goals and how that links with the global indicator framework, which calls for an increase in education for global citizenship as an indicator. And Ed has provided 3 ways of perhaps thinking about global citizenship. But also alongside that, within the framework, is a call for sustainable development and climate change. And this perhaps links back to what Eda was saying, is what does it mean to be human? And what does it mean to be human in the environment that we live in? And how are we, for me, entwined really with that environment and the world around us? So when I was thinking about this, for me, what actually I started to think about is that global citizenship extends perhaps beyond that transmission of knowledge to the leader, and it's how does the leader think strategically about how it is beyond that, and that demand really requires them to not only think but act strategically in both defining and responding to the curricular demands for global citizenship that have come out of the indicator framework and the Sustainable Development Goals. But also that's in a geopolitical context, which can't be ignored because that is the world around us. And leaders have to deal with that day to day.
Yeah.
And this response requires thinking about curriculum, but it also, if you're going to think about curriculum, then you're thinking about change and you're thinking about professional learning for your staff, but also about the operations and relationships, not only within the school, but beyond the school or the organisation. And one of Edda's ways of conceptualizing global citizenship was about thinking how students can critically engage with citizenship.
Right.
And I think that's important if leaders are going to think beyond that transmission of knowledge, then it's enabling the design and the building of a curriculum and an environment that cultivates those skills and those dispositions and that critical consciousness that's necessary if we are helping students to engage and navigate global issues. And those global issues may be being enacted locally. That reminded me really of Freire when he was talking about the need for a critical pedagogy that challenges students to think about those power structures and think about the injustice, the inequalities, and those global injustices. But also bell hooks, who saw education as more than the development of literacy and employability skills, but was a place really not of the passive consumer, but one of an active participant. And that's where really, when we think about curriculum, then what we're actually thinking about is the opportunity for students to be active. And that may be in inquiry-based education, although we have to recognise that governance also controls the curriculum. It may be interdisciplinary, recognising governance regulations and constraints. But what it also would allow is the opportunity to think about critically how the local and the global come together, what the connections are.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there, Cam, because that's really fascinating in relation to the kind of inquiry-based learning. That's what I'm going to pick up later, but you've seen my answers, so now, you know, we can move on to it now. Anita, I'm going to bring Anita in, if I may, at this point, because obviously, Anita, you're a current practitioner, you're a leader of a school, successful school, you're head of Department of Social Sciences. What has your experiences as a practitioner been in relation to perhaps global citizenship, or indeed United Nations, you know, Sustainable Development Goals, or both of those? And then I'm going to ask, if I may, about IBL, inquiry-based learning, if you have experience of that. Don't worry if you haven't, I don't know. But let's start with the Sustainable Development Goals and your kind of oversight of them as a school leader.
So I think I came to sort of this course last year on the conference. Was the first time that I'd heard about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I'd not heard that at all being mentioned at school in any of the CPD that I'd engaged in. And I thought it was really interesting because one of the things that I have really taken away from this course is the importance of creating a vision as a leader and have values.
Yeah.
And I think before engaging in this course, I thought that was kind of PR for leaders. You've got to have a vision, you've got to create values. And I think having sort of read on this course and engaged in all the readings, I've realised how important that is. And we have a saying at school that we are preparing young people for the world beyond education.
Right.
And that, I mean, I teach in a faith school, and we have very clear culture and values that align very closely with those that the United Nations are suggesting anyway. And I think as a leader in a school, to cultivate that is so important because you are preparing young people for the world in front of them. And I think particularly at the moment, we can see how important that is in terms of we have something at school said we're seekers of truth.
Right.
And this brings in, you know, sort of critical and analytical thinking skills. We are, as educators, seekers of truth. When we're presented with curricula, we look at it to see how we can best develop it to serve our students. Students themselves are seekers of truth, and we have, particularly, I'm really lucky because I am head of social sciences, and we, everything we do is embedded in the world around us. So our curriculum is very heavy in where do you see this in the world? Where can you question it? Where are you being a seeker of truth? And I think my role as a leader involves interpreting and translating those values into daily school life. So even when we're discussing behaviour, we have a shared language with the students that talks about justice. And, if you're talking, then the justice is that, your peers are not getting the experience they deserve. So we sort of root that in the language that we use, and this is consistent across the school. And I think not only am I lucky because I work in social sciences, but I'm also lucky because I work in a faith school. I feel it's a little bit easier because of the artifacts that we have, the things that we engage with every day, to embed that culture. And I was recently at another school, and I came away and I thought, actually, I really didn't get a sense of who they were. And it made me realize how important leadership is in sort of shaping that in terms of your values and your culture. In terms of the curriculum, I'm lucky I've got subjects that lend themselves to it. But I think in general, sort of coming away from the conference last year and having talked about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, I brought them back into school. And then that promoted a discussion around this idea of, well, we are trying to prepare our students to be critical and analytical thinkers. Yeah. How do we build that more into our curriculum offering so that they are questioning the information they're presented with, and they are seeking the truth behind that? And I think as leaders of school, we've got to sort of model that sort of global citizenship behavior and not accept what we're presented with, but find out the facts of everything. And I sort of wrote down, I talked about the micro and the macro elements of this. In school, we have an eco group, we have different groups that are involved in debating and looking at other world issues. And then we encourage them, how would you take that into the macro environment? And I think it's really important to give students the agency to do that. And I know in our sixth form, we have sort of leadership roles where they are involved in charities, environmental projects and fundraising. And I think as educators, that's our responsibility, is to build that into school life. Curriculum and academic is important, but you also have to leave school with an understanding of who you are and your place in the world.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I mean, this is such a rich thread of discussion. I mean, Hazel, you'll nudge me if we have any more questions or queries. Can you bring up the poll just about the leadership, question 2, and maybe we will respond to that at this juncture, because I'm going to come back there we go. So section 2 was, the question was from 4 colleagues. What is the main benefit of educational leaders to integrate global citizenship and their establishments? 29% said, echoing what you were saying, Anita, promoting a respectful and tolerant educational environment. Increased pupil engagement, 0. Help student to be able to contribute positively to society, again, one of the kind of visionary aspects of your work there, Anita. And then that's 43%, and 29%, a third of our colleagues said global citizenship benefits, builds for students transferable skills for students entering the workforce. And this is an interesting point, isn't it? That is education, thank you, Hazel, that's great, is education primarily with the economic imperative? We're creating people to fulfill their economic imperative by working in a more to contribute to the country or the nation's economics and so on and so forth. And that's an ongoing debate that we can have in relation to that. But I want to take us back a little bit in relation to the role of students in all of this. And I think, as you were saying, Anita, that you've got, you use the word truth seekers several times. And of course, I would say to you, well, what truth? Because we know some truth is not truthful. we could get into a philosophical debate about this. I mean, perhaps again, this is another webinar, Hazel. But you know, we use this word, do we not? I say we. I mean, you know, it's in the discourse, isn't it? The global discourse at the moment about what truth and some truth and some of this truth that we think is truthful is rather opaque and may be interpreted in different ways. And of course, what we do perhaps as educators and leaders is to try and unpack and unpick that. And I think, Anita, you kind of, you know, framed it by saying, well, actually, it's about encouraging students to be critical thinkers. And that's something in a university we really, really pay a great deal of emphasis and homage to, is developing notions of critical thinking. And Edda suggested to us a little bit about, well, there's issues and problems with the United Nations Development Goals. They forgot about democracy, whatever that may mean. And of course, when we talk about that, I don't want to get into a geopolitical discussion here. Pull me back, Hazel. But, you know, the geopolitics quite rightly at the moment is exercising, you know, nations and nation states, exercising perhaps even civic society in certain parts of the world, whereby we have notions of truth being authoritarian and being played out in response to kind of tariffs and so on and so forth. So, you know, this globalized notion of globalization that we're talking about today is perhaps almost being questioned as we speak through the geopolitical actions of people in power. And so that leaves us with, well, what is it about truth that we need to address? And how do we need, as educators and leaders, how do we kind of respond to those challenges and issues on a macro as well as a micro within the schools, within our educational institutions? Now, we haven't got enough time to debate that question, but what I want to come back to is when we ask children and students to kind of seek some form of truth through criticality, through thinking critically, and perhaps asking that question, oh, why is it this? Then, you know, the notions of inquiry-based learning, again, Karen, you mentioned this, might be one of the ways that we as leaders and teachers develop notions of criticality in enabling students to construct their own knowledge through, you know, kind of these real world problems, whatever real world actually means. But let's not get into that, you know. And has anyone or any, I'll open the debate here, the question to all three of you, but don't speak at the same time, obviously. But, you know, what's your feeling about that students could be part of this debate discussion about global citizenship and how it's taught, how it's kind of constructed, how it's critically engaged with? Is it about inquiry-based learning? I think there's a place for that. I know kind of things like IB help that in some respects, the curriculum. And, you know, is it appropriate? That's a very rhetorical question, by the way, but is it appropriate that we, I guess, ask students to construct their own knowledge? Is this part of what we're doing now in terms of curriculum, in terms of leadership, in terms of education? Thoughts, please, team. Karen's reaching for the button, so I think Karen can go first.
Yeah, okay. Obviously, I raised it as a responsibility of leaders. That it's something that should be considered as part of the curriculum, and probably another point around that, which supports what you're saying, B, is that students' engagement in decision making about policies, which in this case may be how is the curriculum developed around. Right. Because actually what that's doing is I can't remember what you used, the term you used, Anita, but it's a real life experience. It's happening in the moment of being engaged in citizenship, right? But and I suppose I would say that yes, there is geopolitics going on, but it does the global still impacts on the local. Right. And it allows them to think about that, and also to think about that the idea when they're having to be involved in that decision making, that it's not about them as an individual. How do they address inclusion and equity as part of that decision making program, which leaders have to do? That's what leaders do.
Excellent, thank you so much, Karen. Edda, you have your hand up. Thank you. You're muted, I think. You're muted.
Oh, sorry, you missed my joke. Let it. So I think you were raising a good point, and I think that coming back to the previous conversation also in terms of who get to be global citizens and who get to decide what truth is and so on, we could also take into consideration that the young people who are in the school classrooms, who are in schools participating in forms of governments or just learning, they already have experience and knowledge is related to global citizenship. What's more, a lot of issues that cross over with global citizenship discussions, issues about climate change, issues also about technologies, issues about authoritarian systems. The people who are more likely to suffer or benefit from the consequences of all that is the young people themselves.
Right.
And actually, they are, to an extent, very much ahead of the game in certain of these topics that we've seen in climate change, but also in the use of technologies and the critics to it. Young people are the more critics and the more skeptical about the information they receive in social media. So I think that saying we are in a lot of these issues related to global citizenship, we are actually learning together, and we would be very, I would say, not very clever to phrase it somehow if we don't actually work with young people who already have knowledge in developing the type of curriculum that would be more beneficial for them, but also for us and also for all of us as a society. So I would say 100% yes, we do need to involve them in these curricular discussions.
Thank you. Anita?
Yeah, I just want to pick up on what Edda and Karen were saying, really, about to pick up on the seekers of truth. I think it's so true at the moment. I think young people have access to more information than they've probably ever had in the history of education. And I think our role as educators, and having this conversation quite a lot, and it's based around social media and AI, particularly with young people in years, 7, so 11 to 12, 13, in the younger years, and what they believe and how they construct their reality is very different from how I would have constructed my reality. So I think I need to learn from them about what they are seeing and what they're engaging with, just as much as they need to learn from us. And I don't think you can have a lesson or a curriculum that doesn't allow for students to come as they are and to bring themselves as they are. And I think there's this phrase that we really don't understand in schools, but Ofsted have banded it around of cultural capital.
Oh, yes.
And it's where those students are coming from. That's the idea of cultural. That's my understanding of it in terms of what they experience and how they see life. And I think if you're looking at something like global citizenship, that needs to be integral to anything that you are planning to do. And listening to them and how they see the world is really important.
Thanks, Anita. That's really helpful. And that phrase, cultural capital, I think is Bourdieuian. Karen will correct me if I'm wrong. It's interesting, isn't it? We use it, Ofsted are using it, which is quite hilarious in some respects. Ofsted, for those of you who are not familiar with the English inspection system, it's an office of standards in education. So it's a process whereby schools are inspected in a term of 3 to 5 years. I think is around about that. I have lost the plot a little bit on the frequency of his school inspections. But this notion of cultural capital, of course, as Ed was mentioning, the equity issue is important. We're assuming maybe that people have access to social media and indeed understand in part as students what the global world may or may not look like and our role or their role within it. But those who don't or do not have access and don't have that cultural capital from within and from their own private personal lives beyond school, then there are issues and challenges for us as educators and leaders to think about. And I think, Karen, you were suggesting that the curriculum can go to some point if we embrace perhaps an interdisciplinary approach that we may or may not agree with in terms of our offering students a broad-based interdisciplinary curriculum. And I think other curricula across the world maybe is more suited to that. I think the curriculum in the UK may be somewhat limited in terms of performativity and testing and so on and so forth. So we have challenges certainly in the English context, and I know people perhaps comment perhaps beyond those of you who are on the call from other education systems. I'll be interested to hear what you kind of have to say about it. One of the questions that is lurking in my head as I'm listening to you speak is this notion of activism. We hear Greta Thunberg. We've seen her in action, very, very visual activism placed in and around her kind of value system about climate change, particularly. And I know some schools, and Karen and Anita, you may want to comment on this. Some schools feel that they don't want to be associated too much with this notion of activism because potentially it's a kind of challenging, controversial word. But do we have to encourage our students to be activists in some form or another? I mean, Anita, you cited quite a few examples of some of your students in eco warriors doing a lot of work on charities and so on and so forth, which I think is absolutely key. But should we encourage? I'm being political here, Edda. You'll be proud of me. Should we encourage our students to be activists as leaders and as teachers?
I think from my experience, and I've experienced both kind of areas of the spectrum, so either end. And I think probably the best way to deal with it is to harness, if they have that, is to harness it in a positive way and to model for them. Okay, well, if this is what you think, where is your evidence? Where are you getting this from? Where are you getting your information? Who's compiled it? What do you think? What do your peers think? And to encourage them to get as many different opinions as possible, rather than, I think, going back quite a few years now, we had a thing in school where people were really angry and upset about using plastic water bottles.
Right.
And they were very sort of vocal about this. And in a way, it kind of worked everybody up into a frenzy, which was not helpful. And they lost sight of, actually, this is a real problem in society. Plastic is a real problem, but they lost sight of that and got caught up in the activism of it all. Yeah. Which is going to happen with young people, I think. And I think if you can model what that looks like in terms of, if you have something that you feel strongly about, that you feel that there is some injustice or some inequity, then what do we do with that? Because that's really good that you've come across that. It's really good that you've taken an interest. How can we harness that so you can, go out into the world and try to make a difference with this?
Yeah, that's a really excellent example. Thank you. Edda, you put your hand up.
Again, yeah, well, just to totally support what Anita is saying, I think that in terms of thinking about activism, what is, as educators, I believe we shouldn't be doing is fostering activists towards particular causes that are very much politically driven, in a sense of they are in one side or another of the political spectrum. They are very partisan or so on. However, what we certainly can do is try to facilitate that young people get passionate about something to do with politics, because we know that if young people feels totally alienated, that's not going to be beneficial for them or for the society either. We can, as Anita was saying, try to give them a strategy, support them in developing their passions in productive ways that actually can contribute to the benefit of the society as a whole. And we can also be strategic in thinking, okay, which is the framing that we are willing to support? There is certain perspective that no matter whether they are within a democratic spectrum, it's very hard for me to support. So how do we balance all these different positions and support them in their activism, while first not positioning ourselves in a position of telling them what to do, but also not doing it in a way that contradict our basic values in terms of what's right or wrong.
Thank you so much. And I gather I've got about 2 minutes left, Hazel, before you just round us off. So thank you to all the panelists who've been absolutely brilliant in enabling us to understand and more a little bit about global citizenship in the main, and also from their own research and personal and professional insights into this tension-driven and quite controversial subject. So appreciate your kind of responses. I'm supposed to summarize. I'm not sure I can. We kind of agree that the Sustainable Development Goals are useful and helpful, but are problematic in many ways. We, I think, agree, or the complexity of those goals can make life difficult with us in schools as leaders and teachers. Is education merely about preparing for a future workforce? I'm sure we're thinking perhaps that's not the sole purpose of education and leadership. The role of leadership, we framed as important, and leaders in schools, wherever level of the organisation, are important, and they have an important role to play in consultation with other leaders of educational organisations like governors, and how governors' vision and values align with head teachers and principals' visions and values. And again, Anita, you were making comments about that. Karen, you reminded us the importance of governance as an important part of driving the vision and values of a school in relation to notions of global citizenship. We recognise that activism plays a role, but actually it needs to be channeled and harnessed and apolitical, if I can use that word. I'm not sure what I mean by that in terms of EDA, but you were saying it can't be too political in that sense. And perhaps I leave you and leave us all with this notion of this truth seeking. How can we be sure about the truth, what truth, and some truth? Maybe we should all, as leaders, activists, researchers, practitioners, head teachers, principals, keep thinking, because that's always a dangerous thing. And if it's a dangerous thing, we can generate some interesting debate further down the line. So let's all consider, as leaders and practitioners and researchers and academics, to continually seek the truth with our students and the people in our care, because only then, I think, we can make and ensure that our students are fully prepared for the world in which will be complex and challenging in the future. So thank you so much for your help and support and insights, and I'll hand back over to Hazel.
Oh, thank you very much, Bea, and thank you very much, everyone, as well for joining in, to everyone who's kind of participated and shared your thoughts as well during the poll. It's been really, really great to see like quite a lot of different views coming through. So hopefully after sort of seeing the hopefully after sort of seeing today's discussion, you've gained a bit more of an interest into our educational leadership and practice program. So I'm just going to give you a really, really brief overview of the course now as part of that. So MA Educational Leadership and Practice is part-time online and blended course, which is taught here in Manchester and from 5 international centres. So Dubai, Hong Kong, Shanghai and Singapore as well. Now, from each centre, you will receive the same quality University of Manchester education as you would if you were based only here in Manchester, and you're learning from academics from the Manchester Institute of Education, who you've heard from some from today. So what makes this course blended learning as well is that you have the opportunity during each year to attend 2 3-day conferences or workshops at international centres. Basically, that's normally the one that's closest to you geographically. All of the units for this course are taught online and one at a time through a virtual learning environment, with learning materials released at the start of each unit and an understanding of the key dates that you're working towards. We generally anticipate that you need to spend about 15 to 20 hours a week on study, but of course that is an average, and that exact time is going to depend very much on your learning style and your experience to date. In total, the course will take 24 months to complete, and I know that something a lot of our students are really happy about is that there's no exams for this programme. All assessments are coursework based. So on screen you can see a list of our course units which are taught throughout your studies. Each unit runs one at a time, and then after completing each of the taught units, you also complete an independent supervised study or project, which basically involves research skills and applying research to professional practice, and also project-based inquiry. And the idea is that throughout these units is giving you a chance to reflect and a chance to think about the different topics and reflect on your own educational leadership style or the type of leader that you want to become. And throughout these units as well, there's always that chance for collaboration, and really on a global perspective, which is why we've brought in the concept of global citizenship today. And because you will be learning alongside people from across the world. Now, if you do want more information about the course units and you want to talk about the course in any more detail, I do strongly encourage you to either get in touch with me or to get in touch with your centre contacts if you're based internationally, and I will share that in the chat at the end of today's discussion, ways to get in touch with us. If you are interested in studying, we do have some specific entry requirements. So that is a minimum of a 2-1 or the overseas equivalent in an undergraduate degree. And if you've got an initial teaching qualification or at least 1 year's teaching experience, that's also desirable. If you do, if you're slightly under that 2-1 boundary and you've got a 2-2 and you've got at least 3 years of teaching experience, that is also a qualification route onto the programme. And if you're a speaker of English as a second language, we would also ask that you achieve 6.5 overall with no less than 6.5 in the writing component and no other subsection below 6 or the equivalent. And we do accept a variety of English language tests. And if you can't book an English test, it is something that we can support you with as well. So that doesn't need to be a barrier to applying if you're based internationally. Now, there is just one more thing to note about our application portal, and that is at the moment, the 11th to the 14th of April, 2025. So we do have some downtime whilst we perform some essential maintenance. So you aren't able to apply during that time, but from the 15th of April, you'll be able to start submitting applications again if you are interested in your studies, in continuing your studies. And I'm also just going to, if you do want more information about the course, then there is also a chance for you to just indicate this and somebody can get in touch with you. The other question that people do typically tend to ask is around fees and funding. So currently for September 2025 entry, our fees are £17,500, but there are, £17,000. We do have a large number of discounts and scholarships of different funding options available. So I do strongly encourage you to use the contact details on screen, or you can email me studyonline@manchester.ac.uk if you're not sure who the best person to contact is to discuss your individual circumstances and whether any of our funding options are available to you and best suit your circumstances. And overall, that's kind of a very brief overview of the course. I've just shared a few links into the chat as well if you do want any more course information. But otherwise, that kind of brings us to the end of today's webinar and concludes everything. So I do just want to take this opportunity to say a really big thank you to our audience today and also to our panelists for taking time out of their working days. To Anita, it's the school Easter holidays here in the UK, for taking time out of your well-deserved break to come and join us and share your experience as well. It's been a really great opportunity to get everyone together and to hear from you all. So thank you very much, and we'll be closing the webinar shortly. If you do have any more questions, please do put them in the chat and we'll be able to answer those for you.
Thank you.